When a drunken man falls from a carriage, though the carriage may be going very fast, he won't be killed. He has bones and joints the same as other men, and yet he is not injured as they would be, because his spirit is whole. He didn't know he was riding, and he didn't know he was falling. Life and death, alarm and terror did not enter his breast, so he can bang against things without fear of injury. This comes from Shuangzi, one of the foremost Taoist leaders after the initial old master, Lao Tzu. Welcome to Taoism, Lesson 7. For this lecture, I will not only use Huston Smith's book, but I will also borrow other readings from Coutinho and Shuangzi that I hope will facilitate more understanding and possibly open up some new avenues that Huston Smith does not explore. But all in all, this is a very short chapter, so I don't expect this lecture to be too long. We will start with Lao Tzu, the old master, then move on to the three meanings of Tao, the three approaches to power, or De, then the different kinds of Taoism, philosophical, vitalizing, and religious Taoism. After that, we will return to philosophical Taoism. Because this is a philosophy class, this is where most of the prominent theories are going to come from, this section right here. In this section, we're going to discuss the very important and difficult concept of Wu Wei, then move on to other Taoist values, talk about the identity of opposites and the yin and yang, and then we will conclude with a compare and contrast between Confucius and Lao Tzu. So with that, let's begin with the old master. So now we get into the old master himself, Lao Tzu. A combination of history, myth, and legend, Lao Tzu was probably a recluse. Even the name Lao Tzu means old boy, old fellow, or the grand old master. Now, there's a few legends here to decipher. One of them is the meeting between Confucius and Lao Tzu, in which Confucius left that meeting stating, "I know a bird can fly, I know a fish can swim, I know animals can run. Creatures that run can be caught in nets, those that swim can be caught in wicker traps, those that fly can be hit by arrows, but the dragon is beyond my knowledge. It ascends into heaven on the clouds and the wind. Today I have seen Lao Tzu, and he is like the dragon." What's interesting about this legend is it already displays like this dichotomy between Confucianism and Taoism, where Taoism is very much beyond knowledge, or rather beyond social knowledge, or knowledge that is grounded in social norms. For Taoism seeks the beyond, or that which lies beyond. Another legend speaks about Lao Tzu and the fact that he was saddened by his people's disinclination to cultivate the natural goodness he advocated and sought greater personal solitude for his closing years. And upon riding to Tibet, ran into a gatekeeper who, upon seeing this individual, could tell he was a individual of great substance, said, "Before you leave civilization, please pass on your knowledge in one way or another." And that is where the Dao De Jing comes from, which translates into the way and its power. And now even in this legend, there's another strict contrast between Confucius and Lao Tzu. As Confucius was known for going to province, seeking a ruler that might allow him to test his theories, Lao Tzu seemed to have no interest in testing his philosophy, perfectly content with returning to nature or returning to a life of solitude. Now, these legends are arguable, but the one thing no one seems to object to is that even though the Tao Te Ching may not have been written by a single hand, it was extremely consistent throughout. And no matter how many individuals may have influenced the Tao Te Ching, there is no objection to the people referring to the author as Lao Tzu. So with that understanding, now we can move on to the three meanings of Tao. From the opening line in the Tao Te Ching, it is very apparent that the Taoist conception of Tao itself was going to be both an essential and central concept. But Huston Smith points out here that Tao, the concept of Tao, which can be translated into the way, can be understood in three different senses. Now, the first way Tao can be understood is the way of ultimate reality. And here is where we get into that opening line of the Tao Te Ching. And that is, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao, not the eternal Tao. So basically, if you can explain this concept using mere words, it is not the way of ultimate reality. It is not the ultimate concept. Because that which can be explained merely by words is not the true way. So from the opening line of the Tao Te Ching, there is this kind of pessimism towards the ability of human rationality to fathom ultimate existence. As Huston Smith states, above all, beyond all, beneath all is the womb from which all life springs and to which it returns. So for those hyper-reductionists that believe they can explain away reality using their words, the Taoist would tease, those who know don't say, those who say don't know. Now the second form or meaning of Tao is the way of the universe. Now this concept is a little bit less abstract as the last one. For this concept gives actual substance to what they're talking about. It's this driving power in all nature, this ordering principle behind all life. Now this theory is not without merit. For those who are curious, check out the Fibonacci sequence that exists in nature. Or if you want to talk about the way, as in like the way to do something using this understanding of nature as a blueprint, check out the fractal patterns that were found in nature that were implemented in antennas in order to boost cell phone reception. And now these specific designs have become pretty much the staple to boost effectiveness and power. And now there's hardly a cell phone on the market that doesn't utilize this in its hardware. So this is definitely a great example of the quote-unquote integrating principle of the whole, the spirit, as it were, of the universe. Instinct without contrivance, which flows with purpose. This leads us to the third sense of which we can understand or take Tao, and that is Tao as a way of human life. Or more specifically, human life when it meshes with the Tao of the universe, the universal principle that was just discussed. And this is where Huston Smith points out that most of the chapter is going to focus on this kind of Taoist purpose of the way life should be, this normative philosophy that deals with how we should act. But before he can get into that, he needs to discuss the three distinct forms of Taoism. So after explaining the three ways we can refer to Tao, Houston Smith begins talking about the ways in which we can interpret Da. And it is in this interpretation where the distinct approaches to Taoism become so dissimilar. There is such a contrast in views here that it leads Houston Smith to state that these Taoisms are only alike in name. The first two having what he calls standard designations, philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism, but this other one is just too heterogeneous to acquire a singular title. Too complicated in its approach. But for continuity purposes and for our purposes, we'll call it vitalizing Taoism. But this label is fairly misleading because all of them, in one way or another, were engaged in vitalizing programs intending to facilitate Tao's power, the Da, as it flows through human beings. Our first Taoism is efficient power, or philosophical Taoism, described by Houston Smith as a very unorganized Taoist group. It reads almost like a self-help program that utilizes teachers to coach and train their students. Comparing this philosophical Taoism to the vitalizing Taoism, the second Taoism we're going to go over in just a moment, Houston Smith states that these two types of Taoism focus primarily on themselves as self-help programs. But what separates the philosophical Taoism from the vitalizing Taoism is their stance on the Da, or power of Tao. This power that is essential for life, or nourishing life. And this difference is that philosophical Taoists try to conserve their Da by expending it efficiently, whereas vitality Taoists work to increase its available supply. Also called the School of Taoism in China, this philosophical Taoism is associated with Lao Tzu, Chuangzi, and the Tao Te Ching. Houston Smith compares their philosophical approach to seeking knowledge, and in seeking knowledge, gaining certain power. For when one knows how to repair, and in the Taoist case, that's repair one's life, that is wisdom. And this repair involves living in a way that conserves our life's vitality by not expending it in useless, draining ways. And this is where this pivotal concept of Wu Wei is introduced. It's a phrase that translates into inaction, but it's better understood as pure effectiveness, or the way I was taught it, action in inaction. Through Wu Wei, you tap into this ability to conserve your energy. As chapter 23 of the Tao Te Ching states, it is natural to speak only rarely. Violent winds do not last a whole morning, and torrential rains do not last a whole day. What is behind these occurrences? And if the heavens and the earth cannot sustain things for long, how much less the human being? What this points to is this overconsumption of violent or turbulent actions. We'll definitely go into further detail on Wu Wei later on in the chapter, but for now, it's good for you to understand that there's a contrast here between this ability to conserve one's energy and then overtly expending it. This was hinted at in Buddhism, where the best way to trudge forward was kind of at a slow pace instead of an all-out sprint. Long-distance runners do not all-out sprint because they wouldn't make it far. They're there for the long haul. That's the kind of conservation they're talking about here. That's the kind of pure effectiveness that defines Wu Wei. It is a way of reducing this friction that is life-draining. Therefore, it is a friction that must be quelled. So with that understanding, now we can move on to the second form of Taoism. Augmented power, Taoist hygiene, and yoga, the second form of Taoism. Another training program, but of a different kind. As these Taoists did not want to settle for the philosophical approach, the goal of managing the allotted Tao efficiently. They wanted to go beyond this conservation and increase their quota of Tao, or the Tao they had to work with. Their focus is on Qi, which literally translates into breath, but actually means vital energy. It is the power of Tao that courses through one's veins when it isn't blocked. And the overall goal here is to further its flow. And it can be maximized in three ways: through matter, movement, and one's mind. Now, what they mean by matter is that Qi can be augmented nutritionally. So you can increase your life force by eating the right things. Healthy diet, the right blend of medicinal herbs, or as Houston Smith pointed out, even sexual experiments. And breathing exercises. In one way or another, trying to extract or draw out Qi from matter. Now, this kind of method was supplemented by the second way to maximize Qi, which is through movements. And this is an obviously popular form, as most of you have probably seen them perform this. It's Tai Chi, or as Houston Smith calls it, the Tai Chi Chuan, which gathers calisthenics, dance, and meditation with a yin and yang philosophy, and even martial arts to synthesize a way to draw Qi from the cosmos and work to dislodge blocks or blockage within one's internal flow. A great example of this second form is found in Aikido, which the Japanese Do comes from the Chinese Dao, meaning the way. The Japanese term for coordination, which is I. And finally, the Japanese form of Ki, which is the Chinese version of Qi, Aikido. To quote a book by Adele Westbrook entitled Aikido and the Dynamic Sphere, Aikido embraces the yin in order to reduce the effects of overspending one's vitality. Now, the yin is that long haul approach that I discussed earlier, which is opposed to the yang, the way of ferocity, that promotes more friction. Aikido emphasizes the power of yin in its movements to tap into an inexhaustible well. Think of a baby's tiny fist, for example. When it is closed, it's almost impossible to open it up. And yet, in this state, they are relaxed and obviously not straining to resist you. And yet, the fist remains closed. Practitioners of Aikido learn what is called the unbendable arm, their first day of practice. And it's this technique that they utilize in their kata forms. Through the unbendable arm, they learn to kind of relax and resist the instinct to tense up that creates a blockage in their energy. And when they learn to relax and center themselves, this energy can't be broken, just like this baby's fist. That's the inexhaustible well they're referring to. And while learning the unbendable arm, an Aikido practitioner can rest their arm on the shoulders of another and center their ki. If this is done correctly, if they are centered and this flow is allowed, the other individual can try as they might to bend the practitioner's arm, and they will exhaust themselves before it happens. And the other individual, the practitioner, since they are at rest, taps into this inexhaustible well because they're not going to get tired. They're at rest. They aren't straining. This highlights the overall goal in this second form of Taoism, to go beyond conserving qi and, as Westbrook states, tap into an inexhaustible well through movements, or in this case, through martial arts. This leads us to the third instance, which is a way of increasing one's qi through the mind, through meditation and yoga, and using the Sanskrit word yoga because it's so close to the Raja Yoga of Hinduism, working to draw qi from the cosmos itself. But what's interesting about the Taoist yogis themselves, once they're able to tap into this qi, they learn how to beam it towards others. That is why Houston Smith calls it a life-giving enterprise. Through meditation and yoga, they shut out distractions and empty their mind to the point where the power of Tao can bypass their bodily filters and enter the self directly. This is a kind of cleansing ritual where you reach a point of pure consciousness that allows for the spirit to be cleansed. Often the phrase that's coined is cleaning the mirror of your soul. It's a mirror because it's a natural reflection. It's effortless in its way of beaming this qi towards others. However, the cleansing of the soul is very rigorous. This cleansing gets rid of desire, revulsion, grief, joy, delight, and annoyance. And the individual is left with this extraordinary power of stillness. Imagine a calm pond that easily reflects the sky. You can almost see the details perfectly. Yet friction, when you introduce friction, it muddies or distorts the image. Just as the lake returns to its original purity, so must the mind. Once achieved, you are rewarded with a power that could shift heaven and earth. To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders. So these are the three ways to maximize qi that are involved in the second form of Taoism. And with that, we can now move on to the third form of Taoism. Vicarious power, religious Taoism. Now, what the others lack, religious Taoism makes up for. Reflection and health programs take time, and the average Chinese individual lacked that commodity. The response to this is religious Taoism, which institutionalized activities of freelance soothsaying, psychic shamans, and faith healers. What the Taoist priesthood essentially did was make cosmic life power available for ordinary villagers. This was accomplished by utilizing a form of magic, for lack of a better word. And by magic, they mean this means by which a higher occult powers are tapped for the use in the visible world. And Houston Smith goes further into this concept of magic, but it's not really necessary for our purposes. It's just important for us to understand that under this rubric of magic, as traditionally conceived, the Taoist church, dividing the territories with freelance wizards, exorcists, and shamans, devised ways to harness higher powers for humane ends. And that's a fundamental difference between religious Taoism and the other two Taoisms. Religious Taoism sought higher power energies. It proceeds on the assumption that higher power exists. The subtle rules the dense. The energy rules matter. Consciousness rules energy. And superconsciousness rules consciousness. Magic made these powers available. And now that we've gone at great lengths to describe how these three kinds of Taoism are different, we can briefly go over some similarities. There is one unifying principle, and that is the concern on how to maximize the Tao's animating Da. It begins with an interest on how life's normal allotment of qi can be deployed to its best effect, which is philosophical Taoism. From there, it moves on to ask if that normal quotient can be increased, which is the vitalizing Taoism. And then it finally asks if the cosmic energies can be gathered, as if by burning glass, to be deployed vicariously for the welfare of the people who need help. And this is the popular or religious Taoism. No solid wall separates. All three, according to Houston Smith, are better regarded as currents in a common river. To be something, to know something, and to be capable of something is to rise above the superficial. All three are important, for life incorporates the mystic and the direct wisdom of gnosis and the productive powers of magic. Taoist yoga, philosophical Taoism, and religious Taoism. And now we can return to philosophical Taoism. Creative quietude, a return to philosophical Taoism. As discussed earlier, the object of philosophical Taoism is to align one's daily life to the Tao and delight in its flow. But this is accomplished by perfecting a life of wu-wei, pure effectiveness, and creative quietude. Now, Houston Smith brings up this idea of creative quietude because it gives you a good example of how genuine creation, as many artists know, comes when the more abundant resources of the subliminal self are somehow tapped. Basically, when you try to force creation, when you try to force creativity, it doesn't work. Ask a writer who comes down with writer's block. The ability to dislocate from the surface self is a powerful tool. It's almost needed in the creative life. Conscious mind must relax, stop standing in its own light, and let go to break through the law of reversed effort. The idea is to finally let go of this forcing. Let go of the ego. Let go of the surface self. Let that inner mirror shine. And as an artist, as a person who loves to paint, especially watercolor, I can tell you that when I want to tap into that creativity, forcing it is one of the worst things you can do. You almost have to get yourself into this frame of mind where you relax and let that creativity flow. Overexerting, forcing it, even one's own rising frustration, inevitably blocks that creativity. So you need to quiet your mind, achieve a kind of stillness of self to tap into that subconscious. That is wu-wei, supreme action. This precious suppleness, simplicity, and freedom that flows from us, or rather through us, when our private egos and consciousness efforts yield to the power not their own. It's almost as if you have to give up that autonomous need to control everything in order to succeed. Now, this stillness for Taoism is called the original state. In chapter 55 of the Tao Te Ching, it states, for something to be old in its prime is called a departure from the way of things, or Tao. And whatever departs from the way of things will come to an untimely end. This is a specific attack against one's original state, overexerting oneself to the point that they die early. Too much friction, too much stress, until one's vital energy is completely depleted. Take, for example, the ability of a newborn baby. Now, a newborn baby can scream all night and not have a hoarse voice, because they are accorded with the way. They are accorded with this original state. Another great example of the power of Wu Wei comes from Chuangzi, where he states, when a drunken man falls from a carriage, though the carriage may be going very fast, he won't be killed. He has bones and joints the same as the other man, and yet he is not as injured as they would be, because his spirit is whole. He didn't know he was riding, and he doesn't know he has fallen out. Life and death, alarm and terror do not enter his breast, and so he can bang against things without fear of injury. This is another great example of Wu Wei in the form of quietude. If a person was to tense up, their injuries would have been more grand. It is in this stillness that they were able to forego severe injury. This is what Houston Smith means when he says, for this approach to work, one's behavior must accord in the way, tune with Tao, and flow spontaneously. Just to be cannot be forced. Force introduces friction. Being too violent, too progressive, too passionate tends to overspend their vitality. Therefore, Wu Wei is a life lived above tension, never forcing, never under strain. But make sure you don't accord this with a kind of laziness or doing nothing. That's not what they mean here. It is a skill. As Houston Smith states at the top of 209, one may move so well that a footprint never shows, speak so well that the tongue never slips, reckon so well that no counter is needed. Perhaps the most famous example of the power of Wu Wei as a skill is the story of Prince Wenhu's cook. A cook whose cleaver never seemed to lose its edge. It never got dull. He would cut up an ox, and he would go from the hand down and through the shoulder, and would cut with such precision that the ox fell apart with a whisper. The bright cleaver murmured like a gentle wind. Through understanding and skill, he was able to achieve an almost wisping of the blade that would slice through the portions of meat needed without ever having to resharpen the cleaver. That is what is meant by action in inaction. Inaction without the need to force action or supreme action. And this subtleness and the power of subtlety is best represented through the characteristics of water. And to introduce this topic to you and provide some really interesting insight into yin and yang, I am going to defer to an expert in Taoist philosophy. Perhaps you've heard of him. His name is Bruce Lee.
I mean, it might sound too philosophical, but it's acting, or acting, unacting.
You've lost me.
I have, right? So what I'm saying, actually, you see, I mean, it's a combination of both. I mean, here it is the natural instinct, and here is control. You are to combine the two in harmony. Not, if you have one to the extreme, you will be very unscientific. If you have another to the extreme, you become all of a sudden a mechanical man, no longer a human being. So it is a successful combination of both. So therefore, it is not only, therefore it's not pure naturalness or unnaturalness. The ideal is unnatural naturalness or natural unnaturalness.
Yin-yang, eh?
Right, man, that's it. But if you do not have styles, if you just say, well, here I am, you know, as a human being, how can I express myself totally and completely? Now, that way, you won't create a style, because style is a crystallization, you know. I mean, that way, it's a process of continuing growth. Hand-wise, it's very slow.
Oh, is it?
And you push it out, but all the time you are keeping the continuity going. Bending, stretching, everything. You know, suppose, you know, I mean, you just keep it moving.
It's like a belly dancer there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, to them, you see, the idea is running water never grows stale. So you got to just keep on flowing.
Interesting. We don't, in our world, and haven't since the days of the Greeks who did, combine philosophy and art with sport. But quite clearly, the Oriental attitude is that the three are facets of the same things.
Man, listen, you see, really, to me, okay, to me, ultimately, martial art means honestly expressing yourself. Now, it is very difficult to do. I mean, it is easy for me to put on a show and be cocky,
Yeah.
and be flooded with a cocky feeling and then feel like pretty cool and all that. Or I can make all kinds of phony things, you see what I mean, blinded by it. Or I can show you some really fancy movement. But to express oneself honestly, not lying to oneself, and to express myself honestly, now that, my friend, is very hard to do. And you have to train. You have to keep your reflexes so that when you want it, it's there. When you want to move, you're moving. And when you move, you are determined to move. Not taking 1 inch, not anything less than that. If I want to punch, I'm going to do it, man, and I'm going to do it, you see. So, I mean, so that is the type of thing you have to train yourself into it, to become one with the... You think?
Yeah, this is very
Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now, you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now, water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
Empty your mind. Be formless. Don't be too rigid. Don't be too mechanical. Don't be too instinctual. Be like water. Perhaps no greater example in effortless action is how water can support an object and carry them effortlessly on its tide. Water can even support an individual if they stop thrashing and flailing and trust oneself to its support. When an individual just lays down and submits to the water and relaxes, they float on its surface. When they tense up and start thrashing, they sink. Perhaps no better metaphor clarifies Wu Wei than that right there. Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? Can you remain unmoving till the right action arises by itself? Chapter 15 of the Tao Te Ching. Chapter 8. The supreme good is like water, which nourishes all things without trying to. It is content with the low places that people disdain. Thus it is like Tao. Chapter 78. The soft overcomes the hard. The gentle overcomes the rigid. Everyone knows this is true, but few can put it into practice. One achieves Wu Wei in its clarity by being still. That's what they mean by the water, the muddy water, let stand. If you bottle up muddy water and you let it sit, all of the dirt settles to the bottom, and thus it attains clarity. And now with that, we can move on to other Taoist values. Houston Smith starts this chapter by stating that Taoists reject all forms of self-assertiveness and competition. He who stands on tiptoe doesn't stand firm. He who rushes ahead doesn't go far. He who tries to shine dims his own light. As we have just gone over in great detail, Wu Wei, you can see how Taoists would not be okay with such assertiveness. Because again, this assertiveness brings in friction. Friction depletes life energy. And those who deplete life energy die early. So there's almost a reverential attitude towards humility. For Taoists are disinterested in things the world prizes or the world's prides. For these things are not the true values they're thought to be. What is the point of competition or assertiveness? Nature does not have to insist. It can blow for only half of the morning and rain for only half of the day. I've always liked the idea that a tiger does not need to stretch before it runs after prey, which again demonstrates the power of the original state. Another Taoist value goes against this Western ideal that nature is antagonistic. It's an object that needs to be squared off against, dominated, controlled, conquered. Think about how an individual needs to keep cutting back the vines so that it doesn't overgrow and take over their property. Those who would take over the earth and shape it to their will never, I notice, succeed. The earth is like a vessel, so sacred, that at the mere approach of the profane, it is marred, and when they reach out their fingers, it is gone. So nature is to be befriended, but for Taoism, they actually seek more than this. They seek an attunement with nature. Taoist temples do not stand out from their surroundings. They nestle against the hills. They're back under trees, blending in with the environment. This is like the difference between damming a river and then redirecting its flow. Or for those who have watched the movie Avatar, they build their civilization within the trees so that they're not consistently fighting against the weeds. The stronger the tree becomes, the stronger their home becomes. For people are not as formidable as mountains and do not live as long as pines. We do belong, however, in the scheme of things, as do birds and clouds. Therefore, we must work in harmony. Another Taoist value was that travel itself was discouraged. And it was discouraged because they saw it as pointless and basically only conducive to idle curiosity. And so this preference of a naturalness and simplicity was the thing that most separated Taoism from Confucianism. They saw Confucianism as too calculating, to arrange life in a specific order. They figured it's pointless. That's the meaning of the 3 in the morning. And 3 in the morning is a story. Once in the state of Song, Hard Times forced a keeper of monkeys to reduce their rations. From now on, he announced, it will be 3 in the morning and 4 in the evening. Faced with the howls of rebellion, the keeper agreed to negotiate and eventually accepted his monkey's demand that it be 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening. The monkeys gloried in their triumph. This depicts a fight against nature that we will ultimately lose, for we are not as formidable as nature. This leads us to another prominent aspect of Taoism, the identity of opposites. Arguably the most popular and possibly the most iconically associated Eastern symbol is the Chinese yin and yang symbol, which Taoism is very much tied to. Its polarity sums up all of life's basic oppositions: good and evil, active, passive, positive, negative, light, dark, male, female. But unlike what is a common misconception, it's not flatly opposed. It's a complement that balances each other. As Steve Cotino states in his book, An Introduction to Taoist Philosophies, equality presupposes a static conception of balance that would not allow for natural cycles of change. Dynamic balance requires leaving the center and constantly returning. So the yin and yang is not so much about balance, but a dynamic force of push and pull, of leaving and returning, or life and death. The yin and yang can be seen as the hills of a mountain, where one side is green and the other is barren. It's this constant push and pull that creates everything. As stated in the Tao Te Ching, the Tao gave birth to one. The one gave birth to two. The two gave birth to three, and the three gave birth to all creation. So you have one side, you have the other side, and it's their dynamic push and pull that is that third that gives birth to all creation. If it was purely in balance, you wouldn't have that creation. Now, Taoists believe that those who meditate on this profound symbol can find that it affords better access to the world's secrets than any length of words and discussion. This is the power of imagery. This is the power of symbolism. It's almost like one of these meta-truths that appeals to something within you, kind of like a truth that is needed in order to understand truth at all. But see, this begs the question, is there even such thing as good and evil? And in this section, it seems to depart into kind of like a relativism. As Houston Smith states, Taoism eschews all sharp dichotomies. Who knows when the longest way around might not prove to be the shortest way home? You may believe you're taking the shortcut, but then there's an accident on that route, and suddenly it takes you 3 times as long. And that accident isn't something you would have been able to predict. And then insofar as the general skepticism of identity, Chuangzi plays with the concept that once he dreamt he was a butterfly and now he's awoke. However, how does he know that in this state he is not a butterfly dreaming that he is a human? Because in the other state, he was a human dreaming that he was a butterfly. How can he even know? This comes very close to the Cartesian dream argument. For those who want further reading on that, it's the Meditations by René Descartes, where the dream argument basically destroys all concepts of the external world. And for those who have taken my introduction class, you understand what I'm talking about here. But the point is better clarified in the example of good and evil with the story of the horse on page 215. So there was once a horse that ran away. His neighbor commiserated only to be told, who knows what's good or bad? It was true, for the next day the horse returned, bringing with it a drove of wild horses it had befriended. The neighbor reappeared, this time with congratulations for the windfall. He received the same response, who knows what is good or bad? Again, this proved true, for the next day the farmer's son tried to mount one of the wild horses and fell, breaking his leg. More commiserations from the neighbor, which elicited the question, who knows what is good or bad? And for the 4th time, the farmer's point prevailed. For the following day, soldiers came by, commandeering for the army. And the son was exempted because of his injury. It almost seems as though he's talking about why put your ego into it. To borrow another quote, your problem isn't the problem, your reaction is the problem. Now, if this sounds like Zen, you're pretty much in the same ballpark, because Buddhism processed through Taoism is what became Zen. So the riddles that were used in order to elicit a kind of hyperbolic confusion came from Taoism. Now, before we conclude, there is one more specific thing we need to go over, and that is war. For Taoism, weapons are the tools of violence. All decent men detest them. Weapons are the tools of fear. A decent man will avoid them, except in the direst necessity, and, if compelled, will use them only with the utmost restraint. Peace is the highest value. He enters a battle gravely, with sorrow and with great compassion, as if he were attending a funeral. This had a prominent effect on China. As Houston Smith states, putting the scholar as top of the social scale is Confucius's doing, but Taoism is fully responsible for placing the soldier at the bottom. And that's because Taoism really promotes this idea of Wu Wei, and what could be farther from the calm inaction or supreme action of Wu Wei than the deliberate friction and turbulence of war. So in conclusion, circling around like the yin and yang, Taoism and Confucianism represent the two indigenous poles of Chinese character. Confucius representing the classical, Lao Tzu, the romantic. Confucianism stressing social responsibility. Lao Tzu praises spontaneous and naturalness. Confucius focusing on the human, while Lao Tzu focuses on what transcends the human. As Chinese say, Confucius roams within society and Lao Tzu wanders beyond. There is a being, wonderful, perfect. It exists before heaven and earth. How quiet it is. How spiritual it is. It stands alone and it does not change. It moves around and around, but does not, on this account, suffer. All life comes from it. It wraps everything with its love as in a garment, and yet it claims no honor. It does not demand to be Lord. I do not know its name, and so I call it Tao, the way, and I rejoice in its power. So with that, that's the end of Taoism. Next up is the review week. And this review week should narrow down certain things, or at least give you an idea of what I'm going to be focusing on. Although the reading guidelines throughout each week really highlight what is going to be on the exams. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and have a great day.